Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. This is, despite the noise, this is one of our what we call fireside chats for kind of an obvious reason here. It's just something we do in kind of a more intimate setting than at the library or at Cunningham Hall or wherever. And it's a program that is traditionally put together by the Curator, and Diann has put this one together this year, focusing on the Marquis de Lafayette's visit to Milton. Now, obviously, he didn't come only to Milton. He came to, he was here during the war, of course, but came back to visit the States. But Milton became an important part of his tour, and that's what we're going to be enlightened about, I guess, tonight. Diann Ralph, most of you know, I hope. She is our curator, our resident caretaker curator, and she's done, I think, a terrific job. So,
thank you, Steve. That's good. Very good. All right, so. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is our special program, our contribution to what is the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's return to America in 1824. He came, as you probably know, to help us, the nation, celebrate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the country. That event would be called the greatest public event that had ever happened in America. He spent 14 months traveling through all 26 states. That's all there were, all 26 states. And it was nonstop, traveling, celebrating, processions, speeches, military reviews, and much more. The crowds were huge and the excitement was constant. Tonight, we're going to take a very local look at Lafayette's visit and highlight its connections to Milton. Feel free to comment or ask questions as we go, and we'll also have time for that at the end. So who was this man who created so much excitement in 1824? Well, here he is in 1779, at the age of 21, in his Major General's uniform, the buff and blue of Washington and his officers. And you see the black sash. I just recently learned that's a Major General's sash in Washington's army. And he's 21 years old in this. He was often referred to as the boy general. He was a French nobleman who had arrived here at age 19 in 1777. He was extremely wealthy, and he was an orphan. So he was a young man who could pretty much do whatever he wanted to do. And he had become very interested in the 2-year-old American Revolution, not just in military affairs, but also in the ideas of liberty and independence. So he paid for a ship, supplies, a crew, and he sailed over to America to join the Continental Army. The Continental Congress pretty quickly gave him a major general's position, but they did that. They thought, he doesn't have much military experience, but he has a lot of money, and he has the right connections in France, right? He'd been at the court of the king and all of that. Well, they were surprised because he joined George Washington's staff and soon became a trusted aide. Washington came to look at Lafayette as a son, and Lafayette considered George Washington a kind of father. He also became very good in military action. He led troops at places like Brandywine and Yorktown, where Cornwallis surrendered. This portrait was commissioned by George Washington. And again, he's 21 in this image. So 50 years later, he comes in 1824 for the anniversary. James Monroe has invited him to return as the national guest. And that's what he was called a lot as he was here. You'd see it in the newspaper. Sometimes they shortened it to the guest. Today, the guest is going to go visit such and such. He was the only living major general left from the Revolutionary Army when he came here in 1824. So here he is on you're right, now at the age of 67. So, for that time, he was getting up there in age. He's come back to America. And on your left is his son, whom he named George Washington Lafayette. And the son is now about 49 years old. And they also come with a secretary. His name was Auguste Lavasseur. And if anybody speaks French, please correct my pronunciations because I'm not very good at it. So did I do okay? Thank you. Well, feel free to, jump in and correct me. So it's a wonderful thing that this secretary kept a journal for the 2 years that they were traveling. So it's a wonderful source. It's called Lafayette in America. So the tour begins in New York in 1824 in August. And I especially like to show this because it's a wonderful image of what it was like on this tour of America. Now, this is New York, so they really can go all out. But many of the other towns he visited had the same sort of elements. The current military and the vets would come out. They would often have victory arches. You see that back there in the center. And they would put like the names of all of his military victories on the arch, right? So it'd have Georgetown and Brandywine and all those others. Lots and lots of civilians, government officials, and just, everybody would come out for this. Women and children too. And you can see the women and children often wore white. That was, especially if they were part of the celebration. Because, that was their best dress, right? People, American flags and people hanging out of windows. They're about to take off to parade through the streets of New York. They thought maybe as many as 200,000 people saw him in New York. One reporter said, as others would throughout these 2 years, that it was really hard to explain what it was like during these visits of Lafayette. They had a hard time putting words to it. They'd never seen anything like it. Well, after New York, he was on to Boston, and his initial destination was this house, which you may recognize. Today is a historic house museum in Roxbury. It's the Governor Eustace estate. And at the time Lafayette was visiting, William Eustace was the governor of Massachusetts. And so this was going to be the first stop before he went on into Boston. And the secretary's description of this trip to Eustace, I thought was very interesting. It reflects the kind of activities that were going on as Lafayette traveled through the country. He was escorted by military and citizens. It took a longer time than the secretary had expected. A full 5 days and 5 nights on the road. They would be up at 5 a.m., then they would travel until midnight, and then they would sleep for a few hours and do it again. Well, why was it so slow? It was so slow because of all the people who would come out to meet Lafayette. The people slowed them down. The secretary wrote about this, though, and said that these displays on the road were very moving and sublime. We did not complain of the fatigue. Even our night marches had charm. There were long lines of carriages led by torches, fires lit on the hillsides, trumpets echoing in the woods, and the sound of bells announcing our arrival at each town we passed. Sounds pretty wonderful. Finally, they arrived in Roxbury at 2 a.m., and sure enough, the roads were lit, the houses were lit, everybody was waiting up for him. So they didn't get to bed until about 3 in the morning, and they were awakened at sunrise. So they got about 2 hours of sleep. Well, sometime during this trip into Boston, Lafayette received some unhappy news, but news that would eventually lead him to Milton. His good friend and fellow revolutionary, the former president, John Adams, sent a message to Lafayette. He said, "I would wait upon you in person, but the total decrepitude and imbecility of 89 years has rendered it impossible for me to ride, even so far as Governor Eustace, to enjoy the happiness of seeing you." So he asked Lafayette to spend a day with him in Quincy. Well, Lafayette had a very full schedule, but he wanted to fit this in somehow. But for now, he was headed to the State House in Boston and his appointments in the city. The secretary describes arriving at this point in town. Do you recognize it? So we're at Tremont Street, looking up Park Street to the State House and Beacon Street with the Common on the left. There were 2,500 school children on the Common, all ready to welcome him, as well as light infantry lined up along the route, and many other people as well. So he was going to be at the State House soon, but he was first going to stop at this house here on Park Street. I don't know if you recognize it, it's still there. We're looking from the State House back down Park. Common is now over on our right, and these are the houses, some of the earliest mansions on Beacon Hill. It used to be a Dunkin' Donuts. Is it Starbucks now?
One of the two, I don't know.
Well, good guess, because until recently it was a Starbucks right over here. I mean, a Dunkin' Donuts. It might be Starbucks now.
Well, that's like where the Union Club is.
Yeah, that's the second one down, isn't
Yeah,
it? The
right.
Union.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a Park Street Church in the background.
Yeah.
Yes, Park Street Church down there that you see. And this has had a commercial, I think a restaurant. I don't know if it has any private residence anymore in there, but it changes.
It used to be like a Fox.
Yeah.
Yeah,
State
right.
Fox at a local 25, a studio there for a short amount of time.
I remember that, right. Well, this was the building that the city of Boston picked, and there were some political things going on, a long story too, but they thought this was suitable for the hero of the American Revolution. His secretary said that it was fit for a French hero. Now, they rented it, but it wasn't furnished for Lafayette's stay, so they had to get it furnished, and it was furnished in large part by a man from Milton. This is the railway house, right? The railway house. Tavern in Milton. I don't think it's there anymore. This was once owned by Daniel Vos, the father of Isaac Vos. And Isaac Vos grew up here, and he would become a cabinet maker and become one of the finest furniture makers in the early 19th century in Boston. So who do you call when you have about 6 weeks, they didn't have much time, to find 78 pieces of furniture for seven rooms in this mansion? You call Vos and Sons, apparently. That's what they did. And the company was able to fulfill the order. Now, the senior Vos, Isaac Vos, had passed away just shortly before Lafayette came, but his son was carrying on the business. And as a kind of side note, Milton connection, at some point Isaac Vos' company was using mahogany that had been sawed at a sawmill here in Milton, one owned by Daniel Vos, the owner of this house. So it's quite possible some of that Milton mahogany ended up, as a chair for the general. You can find the story of Isaac Vos and his furniture making and the furnishing of Lafayette's quarters told in a book that we have on display in the next room, which you'll be able to see if you like. It's entitled Rather Elegant Than Showy, The Classical Furniture of Isaac Vos by Robert Mussey and Clark Pierce, published by the Mass Historical Society. It's a beautiful book. Although he was the premier furniture maker in the early 1800s, Vos was largely forgotten for almost 200 years until the Mass Historical Society and these scholars undertook a study of his work for a major exhibition at the Mass Historical Society. Here's an Isaac Vos couch. The book tells the story of the identification and restoration of this neoclassical couch, considered a fine example of Boston furniture, and one of the pieces made by Isaac and Sons to furnish Lafayette's lodging. It's rosewood covered in crimson plush with gilt carvings in a style thought suitable to sophisticated French taste. It was in a 20 by 40 drawing room on the first floor of that Park Street house. And it was a very large entertainment space meant for public receptions while Lafayette was there. And it also contained a very fine pianoforte made by another Milton craftsperson, Alpheus Babcock. Alpheus Babcock was raised just down the street on Canton Avenue here at 1157. The house is still there, private residence. And he and his brother started making pianos down there. And by 1810, they were manufacturing pianos in Boston and making some of the best. Babcock was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame a little late in life, a little late in his history, I guess, because that didn't happen until 2007. But he was inducted for his 1820s invention of an iron frame for pianos. So before that, they were all wood inside. With this iron frame, you could get better tension and durability and tension on the strings, a finer sound. And this soon became the way to make pianos. This is a Babcock piano. I don't have an image of the one that he made for Lafayette's house, but there is an image of it in that book I mentioned in the next room. And the national guest, this is from a Boston paper, was ready to start all the festivities in Boston. But Lafayette very much wanted to go see his old revolutionary friend, John Adams. So one Sunday in August, the 29th of August, excuse me, after attending church at the Brattle Street Church, which is where City Hall is now, I believe, is where it was, Lafayette headed for Braintree, or today's Quincy, to see Adams. Unlike his other travels on this trip, he wanted this to be a quiet and subdued trip without any pomp or circumstance. It was Sunday, and he was going to see a very ailing former president. So he wanted it to be low-key. He may have gone in this carriage here that you see in the front. It's a French pronunciation, I think, barouche. Okay, I'm okay? Okay, good. A barouche that was made especially for him. It's for 4 people, really, or not much more than that. There's a seat in the back, and then there's a back-facing seat in the front. Probably recognize this with the top down. It's the royal family uses this kind of carriage to parade through London and so forth. So it's likely he took this one. We don't know for sure. He went with a very small party, basically just his son and secretary with a couple of other people from Boston. And no doubt they went out of Roxbury, down the highway that went over Milton Hill and into Braintree. Today, part of that is our Adams Street. About 10 miles into the 13-mile trip, Lafayette stopped here. This house still exists today at 203 Adams Street, the very top of Milton Hill. It's right across from Hutchinson's Field with the beautiful views. And it was the home of Amos Holbrook. Dr. Amos Holbrook had built this house in the early 1800s. He was a Revolutionary War surgeon who moved to Milton in 1777. Now, he's probably best known for his experiment with smallpox inoculations here in Milton. And because of his work, he made Milton the first American community to establish first town to establish smallpox inoculations for its residents. Now, the records tell us that Lafayette did indeed visit here with the doctor. One newspaper said he did as much visiting with Holbrook and local citizens as the solemnity of the day would allow. So again, it's Sunday. But the records do not tell us much more about his visit. Some of you may have read the Teal History of Milton, written in 1872. Well, Teal mentions this visit in his history. He doesn't seem too surprised that Lafayette would come because Holbrook hosted a lot of prominent men, he tells us. And then he says that Holbrook's grandchildren, some of them still living, could tell wonderful stories about Lafayette's visit to Amos Holbrook. Period. End of section. He moves on to write about something else. And maybe those stories were written down and saved somewhere, but we haven't found them yet. So if you do happen to come across, it would be great to have them. So frustrating. But we do know that he was here. It might have been just a fairly convenient place to stop before he got to Adams' home. Perhaps Lafayette knew the doctor in some way. We can't be sure. But there are a few connections that are interesting to think about as possible reasons why. One of them is the Civil War general, Joseph Vos. This is his house, also still existing on Vos's Lane. So Amos Holbrook had been a Revolutionary War soldier from 75 to 77. And during that time, he had served under Joseph Vos. And apparently they got to know each other. And when Holbrook was ill and had to get a discharge, General Vos convinced him to move to Milton and become a doctor there, which is what Holbrook did. I should also mention that Holbrook was President Adams' physician and also physician to a lot of the other Adams family members. So Adams may even have said, why don't you stop by there on your way? But Vos, there was another connection with Vos and Lafayette that is interesting. So Vos served in the Continental Army throughout the war, ending as a brigadier general. And he knew Lafayette very well. He served under Lafayette, most notably at Yorktown. And Vos isn't in this image, but this is General Washington at Yorktown with his generals. And Lafayette is on your right, sort of behind Washington. And again, Vos served under Lafayette at Yorktown. So this is where they laid siege to Cornwallis and his army, and then later Cornwallis surrendered. And the war was essentially over. So very important battle. And at Yorktown, Lafayette commanded one of 3 divisions under Washington, and it was the Light Infantry Division. And that's where Vos served. Now, the light infantry, here are 3 different versions of the 2 on this side are images made during the time period. The middle one is Lafayette. Those are dragoons that he's immediately talking to, but the light infantry is in the back there. And then over here we have some modern reenactors who are portraying light infantrymen. And it turns out that the light infantry was especially beloved by Lafayette. He was very fond of all military people and vets. But the light infantry, which again Vos had been serving in, seemed to be very special to Lafayette, probably because of its important role at Yorktown. The secretary wrote in his journal about the morning that Lafayette saw some light infantry at the Eustis Mansion. This was the morning that they had, this was the day they had spent overnight there. And apparently, it was the light infantry had come to see Lafayette, and they woke him up at daybreak, after going to bed just at 3. But I guess he had a good humor about it. He looked out the window, and he saw that it was indeed a company of the light infantry. And his secretary said that the sight of this uniform deeply affected Lafayette. He could not keep his eyes off of them, and he exclaimed at every moment, "My brave light infantry, what courage, what resignation, how much I love them, how much I love them." So a lot of dots that don't necessarily connect, but we have Vos, who's very close to Holbrook, and Vos, who's very close to Lafayette. Now, Vos had passed away before this visit, but it's possible that over the course of years, Lafayette had put, Vos had put Lafayette in touch with Holbrook. We really don't know. It's kind of interesting to speculate. We do know that Lafayette left in the afternoon from Holbrook's house to go to dinner with John Adams. And I love these images. This one is done in 1822, so about the time Lafayette was traveling from here to see John Adams. This is going by the birthplace. And then here's another great picture of the big house, Peacefield. Again, about the same time period we're talking about. So we've got somebody out in the carriage, maybe on a Sunday afternoon. It was interesting that the secretary wrote in his journal that he and Lafayette were quite surprised that Adams lived in such a modest house for a former president. But then they went on to say it was just a one-story house, and none of those houses are one-story, I don't think so. I'm not quite sure what, maybe it was, I don't know where that comes from, but they did go, and they did have dinner with Adams. Here is John Adams just about the time of this visit. So he's 89 again, and his secretary, Lafayette's secretary, wrote that they found Adams detained at his retreat by the weight of 89 years. He couldn't go out. He could hardly raise himself from a chair or feed himself without help. Still, he and Lafayette had a visit that was quite satisfying to both men. Adams' grandson, I think it was Charles Francis, would say that his grandfather was considerably affected by the meeting. He also said that due to his illness, his grandfather was somewhat less cantankerous than he had been during most of his life. He was known for that, wasn't he? I guess. Sadly, it was illness apparently that made him somewhat less. Well, Lafayette will return to Boston for another big day of events and then go on this 26-state travel. He will never again, as far as we know, get back to Milton. But a Milton man will commemorate Lafayette's trip in a very special way. Talk about memorializing Lafayette for just a moment. It was big business. Everybody got their souvenir of the visit. These white ribbons you often read were military men and vets were wearing them. The little ad up there just before Lafayette arrives, you could go down to State Street and get your silk scarf with Welcome Lafayette, or your silk handkerchief, I think it was, with Welcome Lafayette written on it. He does say that they're available in quantity, so you might have had to buy several, I'm not quite sure, but he was producing these. Here we have rosettes or cockades. So what you saw on that first slide when you came in was the Lafayette cockade. It was actually something, cockades were made of ribbon, usually rosettes, sometimes longer streams of ribbons. And they could be they were an identifying symbol, really. George Washington created a black cockade for his officers to wear on their hats. This one Lafayette created during the French Revolution. Luckily, it's the same colors as the American flag, right? So doubly appropriate for the big anniversary. These are in a museum in Philadelphia and said to be something that the ladies wore on their shoes. You could wear them, anywhere, but these were on the ladies' shoes, apparently. And over there, another very popular item, white leather gloves with Lafayette's image on them. I think they made them for ladies and men. These are ladies' gloves. It's said that Lafayette would not kiss the hand of a lady wearing this glove because it would seem improper to be kissing his own image. I don't know if that's true. I think maybe he was just tired of all that bowing and kissing and bowing and kissing. Right? Gave him a chance to pass some of that by. Don't know. Well, our Milton man, Jazaniah Ford, will commemorate Lafayette's visit. This is first he was a card manufacturer, a playing card manufacturer, one of the first in America to officially be in that business. And in 1812, he did this pack of cards to commemorate Stephen Decatur's military victory during the War of 1812. And this is the ace. So if you were the person being commemorated, you were on the ace of spades. Well, when Lafayette comes, he does a deck for Lafayette. So this is the Ace of Spades for the Lafayette deck. It was done in greens and blues. At the bottom is a cannon. At the top is the American eagle. Carrying a banner. The banner says "Made in America," right? Or American manufactured. So this was a time, early 1800s, 1820s. It was all about America making its own things, right? Whether it was literature and Ralph Waldo Emerson or playing cards or whatever it was, there was a lot of pride in the new nation starting to be able to make all its own things and not depend on Europe. Well, that's one reason they put that up there. So these cards were made most likely down at Highland Street and Spafford Road, if you know where that is. It's hard for me to describe, but not far from the police station. Okay, that road. That's where Ford had his home and his manufacturing facility. It's no longer there. These cards were sold all across the country, and for museums and collectors who are interested in these sorts of cards, they're highly desirable, and we have several in our collection. And we have one of the original Lafayette's Ace of Spades in the other room for you to take a look at from our collection. And again, just another Milton sideline. It's thought that at least some of the paper that Ford used in his cards came from the Tilston and Hollingsworth paper mill in Milton. And Ford was also a Revolutionary War vet. Well, so Lafayette's gone off to visit all the other states, and before he left, the officials in Boston asked if he would please come back for the laying of the cornerstone for the Bunker Hill Monument. And that was set for the following June of 1825. And Lafayette said, "Sure, I will." Now, apparently, from some reports, a lot of people thought that would never happen, right? Because you're off on a 26-state journey with all the demands on Lafayette, and how's he going to make sure he's back in time? But he did arrive 2 days before the ceremony on June 17th. At least one person wrote that his ability to get back seemed magical. So he could do no wrong, I think. Yeah, Lafayette. But that was a feat. So he would participate in the ceremony to lay the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument in a couple of days after his arrival. And he would do that with a little help from another Milton man. So here's the Bunker Hill Monument. This is not the way it looked, obviously, when the cornerstone was laid. That took another 15 years or so. This is around 1843, about the time it was finished. But I wanted to think about this for a minute for the sense that it can give you of what the landscape and the views look like on the day of the cornerstone laying. Thousands and thousands of people attended the ceremony. It was another one that left a lot of people speechless about trying to describe what it was like that day. The weather was great. There was a grand procession of 7,000 or 8,000 people that moved from the State House with Lafayette leading the way over to Bunker Hill. He was in a beautiful carriage drawn by 6 white horses. As many as 200,000 citizens from all over the country were said to have attended that day. In honor of the ladies who don't come much into this story that we know of, I'm sure they contributed in many ways to this. And actually there were some interesting ladies that traveled with Lafayette, but that's a whole other story program. So the reporters were writing about the upcoming ceremony, and they said that the ladies, they're expecting ladies who will be unexampled crowds of female beauty. They were expecting a lot of beautiful ladies to come to the ceremony. Later reports tell us that during some of the ceremonies there was a spot with awnings to protect the ladies from the sun. And those spots were filled by over 1,000 ladies from all parts of the Union, presenting a spectacle of animated beauty and intelligence. So that was a nice addition. Linda Peary, our vice president of the society, has been looking a little bit into this ladies and the Bunker Hill Monument, and she's found for us that there was a certain group of ladies in Boston who were very influential in helping to get the monument built, because the funding had sort of dried up, and they went out and did some drives to get donations, and they were able to sort of help restart the whole monument. So they did, in fact, play important roles. Well, when the cornerstone was being laid, the monument probably looked more like this. This is actually 1830, so we're 5 years past the laying of the monument. It's only grown a little bit. So this is more like what it looked like on the day of laying the cornerstone. The monument was being built with the help of many craftspeople and laborers and people raising money. And among those people that were very instrumental is another Milton resident, this time William Gardner. This is William Gardner's home at 594 Adams Street in East Milton, still there today, a private residence. It's the oldest existing house built in East Milton. Gardner, as a young person, age 12, has started as a stonemason apprentice. By the age of 21, he was working for this man, Gridley Bryant. And Gridley Bryant was a master builder. Shortly after the dedication of the cornerstone, this man would work out the idea for the granite railway, which was established as the first commercial railway in America, and established to haul granite from Quincy through Milton on the Neponset so it could be taken to Boston to build the monument. So Gardner helped Bryant not only build the Bunker Hill Monument, but to lay the foundation for the railway. And he also worked on Paul's Bridge in Milton and the Central Avenue Bridge across the Neponset, and several other things. Well, on the day of laying the cornerstone, it may have looked something like this. Now, Gardner is said to have you read things that say he placed the stone, he laid the stone, he set the stone. I was wondering, what did he really do? How could this all have worked? I mean, look at the size of that granite boulder. And, Lafayette is said also to be there, sort of laying the stone, right? Well, part of the monument laying ceremony was led by the Masons. So Lafayette, as well as many of the people of the time, like George Washington, were all Freemasons, and they have a ceremony for cornerstone laying, and they use a lot of terminology like that sound like you're building it, but it's more sort of symbolic, not literal when they're talking about it, if that makes sense. So they were saying these things, doing their ceremony here. But it was kind of a symbolic, ceremonial laying of the cornerstone. Now, William Gardner, many years later, gave an interview to the Boston Globe. And he explained that there had been a lot of people working to set this up for the ceremony, and that during the ceremony, Gardner, had handed the trowel to Lafayette, who spread the mortar, and then William and his fellow builders actually placed the cornerstone. So I don't know if you've been burning to know what really happened that day. I started to be, so I was very pleased when I finally got the picture better in my mind from Mr. Gardner. Well, the last thing here on the Bunker Hill Monument maybe is that Levasseur, the secretary, at the end of the day, reflected on what he had seen And this is one of the things that he said. The care with which Americans preserve and revere all the monuments of the Revolution is very remarkable. Everything which recalls this glorious epoch is to them a precious relic which they regard with almost religious reverence. This sort of devotion is praiseworthy since it feeds the sacred fire of love and liberty. So that was what we were doing 200 years ago with our monuments. Well, Lafayette and his secretary took home some mementos themselves. They got their own souvenirs. They were at a dinner of 1,200 people on the Common, and one of the things that was sort of a centerpiece was this large silver bowl that was full of things that had been found at Bunker Hill after the battle. So there were uniform buttons from, I think, both British and Americans. There were bullets, parts of guns, things like that. I guess what you would find on a battlefield. And Lafayette and his secretary were given the chance to take whatever they would like to take from this bowl. Speaking of mementos and souvenirs, I almost forgot this again. I got caught up in the whole Lafayette in America thing. And I found a little Lafayette online. I like him very much. He is wearing the buff and blue suit of a Washington officer. He's been hand-painted by a woman who says that her shop is very near the Yorktown battlefield, which adds, I think, extra sort of importance or to General Lafayette. So I'm going to donate him to the Historical Society. Our Christmas tree ornament collection are all historical. So if I can manage to give him up, he's going to be on the Christmas tree. I'll pass him around. He's adorable, don't you think? He's adorable. So I will, isn't he nice? Yeah. So I want to end with a story of one more kind of keepsake from Bunker Hill. It's a very unusual memento that Lafayette took back with him to Paris. So in 1825, he'll return to Paris after this big trip, where he dies about 9 years later, and he was buried at this private cemetery next to his wife, Adrienne, who had died much earlier. Now, this is still there today, from what I read online. It's a private cemetery since the French Revolution, so it is a place where families secretly buried their relatives who were victims of the Reign of Terror. And then later on, I think they're buried sort of in mass graves. And then they kept this cemetery going. And you can be buried there only if you are now a descendant of someone who was killed during that part of the French Revolution. Now, his wife's family was really wiped out on the guillotine. So that's why she and he are there. The story, some of you may know it. Thank you. Some of you may know the story of the flag over his grave. I don't know. I've told that. Anyway, I've decided not to try to tell it because I can't do that without choking up. So, but you can find it online. But it's a wonderful story of the first flag that was placed there in World War I, and it's now replaced, American flag replaced every year. Well, reports of Lafayette's burial, from those we learned that he had brought home a large trunk loaded with dirt from the Bunker Hill Monument building site. According to his wishes, his son, George Washington Lafayette, spread this dirt over his father's body in the grave. fulfilling Lafayette's wish to be buried in American soil. So I hope we've added a little to the story of Lafayette's grand tour, stories of those from Milton who helped prepare for his Boston visit, stories of his quiet, slightly mysterious trip to visit Amos Holbrook before he went on to see Adams, a few stories of Milton's vets, and then those artists and craftsmen who were creating memorials and monuments to the Revolution and to Lafayette. So now, if you like, we can take a few minutes for you to add some comments to the story or to ask questions if you have them.
Can you make a little booklet of all these wonderful descriptions you've given to us? In your spare time?
Yes, in my spare time.
I'm joking.
You think that people would be interested in a booklet of the stories?
Oh, I do, yes, and you've got wonderful illustrations to go with them. It's a wonderful story.
It's all about the pictures, isn't it?
No, but they
No, I'm serious. No, I mean, yes, that would be yes. I think that's a great idea. Maybe there's another author out there who'd like to think about that, but that is a good idea. Yeah, and it wouldn't be that difficult to do, right? Thank you. We'll put that on the list. Yes?
Where did he end up having dinner with President Adams?
Where?
At Peacefield?
Again, that's a little unclear to me. Maybe some other sources would mention it. Because he says that Adams' house was one story,
Right.
that doesn't make sense to me.
No, that's why.
And then there is mention that other people were at the dinner, right? So Charles Francis Adams was there and some grandkids were there. So it seems like maybe it was a big event. So maybe it was in the bigger house. I don't actually know. That's not to say nobody knows, because maybe if we dug a little farther, we could find out. But he did visit him in his home in what was Braintree then. If you find out, let me know, because I'd like to know. Do some digging. Was there another? Yes.
It seems pretty amazing to me to think that it's 200 years, and how much things have changed over the course of these 200 years. But thinking about him traveling all of that time for 2 years with so little sleep, and just wondering what amenities there were and weren't compared to what we have now, just seems pretty amazing.
I agree, and add to that. 67 today is not old, but 67 in then, with the kind of understanding of medicine and health and diet and all of that, he was getting up there. So he's doing all of this as an older man. I'd add to that. It had to be tough. Now, because he was Lafayette and people were, constantly aware that he was coming to town and wanted to greet him and wanted to feed him and all of that, I think that in some ways he probably got the best of what people could offer. But it must have been pretty hard on him. I haven't laid out the whole 2 years of trips, but it seems like he was pretty much moving. When he came back from Adams, I think he took an unscheduled trip because Portsmouth wanted him to come. And so he went, he stopped in Marblehead. We've got a letter copy in there of the letter he wrote to Marblehead. And he went up to Newburyport, and then he went to Portsmouth, Naval Yard, and then he hurried back to Boston because he had to be somewhere in Boston in a couple of days. So, that would tire me out in a car, I think. And, with all the rest stops and things that we have today. So, great point. Yeah, I don't know.
Did you do any of that traveling by sea?
By sea?
Yes.
That's a good question. I'm not so familiar with his trip south, and something just rings a bell like, maybe I have read that, like, for some of these coastal cities and things, especially in the South. Maybe he was going, or down the rivers. Good question. I'm not sure. Does anybody know? Anybody happen to know? But maybe he did. That was, probably a better way to go, right, than by road in those days. So I would recommend, if you like this kind of detail, Lavasseur's journal is a great place to go. It has been translated. It's 2 volumes. It covers the whole trip in pretty good detail. It's called Lafayette in America. And there's a fairly recent translation by a man named Alan Hoffman. I think that's the one to buy these days, is his translation from the French. Other comments? Thoughts? Well, if you learn any more great stuff about Lafayette in America, and especially in this Milton portion of it, do let us know. We invite you to spend some time in the next parlor, where we have a few exhibits, including that book about Isaac Vos and the Lafayette Ace of Spades. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you over in the next room.